Reconstruction, Readjustment, and Race, 1865 to 1875, Chapter 16. This chapter only is 13 pages long, and believe me, if you have read it, which I'm sure you have already, you'll find that it deals more with the political upheaval during that 10-year period than it does anything about race. But we're going to go with the flow. 13 short pages. So, what does freedom mean to the newly freed black men and women? The ability to move without owner's permission, to find their family, the ability to get an education, the ability to own land. The main thing it meant to them, of course, was to have the same civil rights as the white man. Whereas the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 had only affected states in rebellion, or any place that the Union troops had control of, it did not affect Kentucky or Missouri or Maryland or Delaware or later on Western Virginia, because they had not seceded, even though they were slave-holding states. But even after the war was ending, Kentuckians were very resistant to recognize freedom of their slaves. It was just something that was hard for them to grasp emotionally, culturally, and economically. And of course, General John M. Palmer, who went against the prevailing attitude of the state to force the recognition, he would issue what they call passes to allow the slaves, who are now former slaves, to cross the Ohio River into freedom, and caused a great deal of concentration of the newly freed slaves to be in Louisville, and caused a great deal of hatred, I guess you would say, for the Union general. But part of the reason, because Kentucky took so long to decide which way she was going to jump, and the fact that it was a brothers' war, we had people in our state who were for the Confederacy, people who were for the Union, and you couldn't tell by just looking at someone which way their feelings lay. To help punish Kentucky, she was kept under martial law until October, which is sometime after the war had ended. And this only increased the bitterness and hatred we had for the federal government. The 13th Amendment was passed on December the 18th, 1865, and we fought it tooth and nail. Oh, we refused to admit it had happened. We did not want it at all. And as late as, 2 years after the war, we still had some slaves in bondage because, we didn't know the war was over. And I just don't believe, since we haven't ratified that 13th Amendment, it should affect us. I mean, it's all kinds of excuses. And yet there were some slaves who voluntarily stayed with their former owners because it was something, lifestyle they knew. They liked their owners. They hadn't been bad to them, and they were actually being paid now. But that was a small majority. The slaves, the first thing they want to do, of course, is leave the plantation without permission. And they wander around and they head for the cities. And like it points out, Lexington's population increased over 130%. They thought life was going to be better, but city life did not guarantee you better conditions. And your text mentions Owensboro and Paducah, because of having to live on the streets and sleep on the ground, there was a lot of diseases and people were dying of fevers. There was a lot of hatred against the blacks. Whenever anything doesn't go the way you want it to, you have to have someone to blame. And of course, the easiest, most available person to blame was the newly freed black. And I'm very ashamed to admit that during the 4 years after the war, there was over 100 documented lynchings. And the reason I say documented, because a lot of times there would be hangings or lynchings and no one would know anything about it. We had a group called the regulators who would regulate and administer justice and be judge, jury, and executioner. There was no trial. There was no appeal. They claimed they were trying to get rid of the lawlessness that was going on in Kentucky, which we get more into in the next chapter. And of course, there was the KKK. The KKK never really was all that big in our state, and actually the KKK has been grossly misrepresented. Was there an organization called the Ku Klux Klan? Yes. Did it target the newly freed black? Yes. Did it target the white people who assisted the newly freed black? Yes. But the official KKK only lasted about 4 years. It was disbanded totally in 1869. Their paraphernalia was burned, their rule books were destroyed, and the official KKK was gone. People using the guise of KKK and using their paraphernalia, if you would, and actually the original KKK didn't even use masks. They had white sheets they put over themselves sometimes, but they had a uniform and they were not ashamed to go with their faces uncovered. It's only later that they started doing that, and it wasn't the real KKK. It was, white camellias, night riders, all these other crazy names, and it was more prominent in further south than it was in Kentucky. But the regulators were the one who was administering all the kangaroo justice. So as much as we had hatred for the free men who wanted to have the same rights as we did, we opposed his education. And our state seemed to be the one who opposed it the most. Even Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi didn't oppose educating the blacks because they figured that with no taxes coming from these people, they didn't have any decent schools and they would never be able to teach a black man to read and write anyway, so what's the point of opposing something that's going to fail? But here in Kentucky, we resented it bitterly. And when the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands Act, which we just call the Bureau of Refugees, was very underfunded. But they had some very dedicated people who tried to work. And one of the things they were supposed to do was to act as a go-between between the former slave owner and the former slave and come up with some kind of a legal contract where the former slave could get paid. They were also to provide food and shelter. But in all honesty, their most success came in the area of education. Now, only in Kentucky, it seemed like, were most of the teachers of African-American descent. But they were not people who had been working in the cotton fields who didn't know how to read and write. These were educated blacks who came down from Ohio or from other places. But we hated them so bad that we burned their schools, we beat the teachers, we threatened the students. We did everything we can to stop them. And despite all the attempts to stop, more blacks attended school than white students in Kentucky. Now, we had the distinction of being the most southern state against the Bureau and caused them the most problems. And I don't like the idea that we had that distinction, but there again, like I say, if you hate the black man, you're going to hate anything that is remotely helping him. And they claimed that the Bureau was, it was being prejudicial. Well, it was set up to help the newly freed men, and it would also help the poor black if you needed help, but of course the poor black wasn't going to admit needing any help. The next section of your text, the next 5 or 6 pages, it's, like I say, it spends more time explaining the progress and growth or death of parties and who was running for governor and why and their politics. And we're just going to spend a few minutes on the different parties and what ended up. Unless you're in political science, these people are really about 1 or 2 term, not even 2 term, but they're 1-term governors, and they all have the same leanings. That Clay's Whig Party's gone. The old Union Party became known as the Republican Party, but it was not to be confused with the radical Republicans of the North, because the radical Republicans of the North wanted to punish the South. The Republican Party in Kentucky didn't necessarily want to punish, they just wanted to give civil rights to them. But they wanted Kentucky to be seen as a loyal state, and they saw themselves as progressives. But they really wanted to reshape Kentucky like the North. And they did welcome black voters because, the blacks, when they could register to vote, would want to join the party of Lincoln. The Democrats, and all they're doing is name calling. They're calling the Republicans red Republicans, radicals, radical abolitionists, or Jacobins, which your text explains was a name given for the revolutionaries in France. They did not want the black man to vote. They did not want racial equality. They wanted to go back to the way things were before the war. And they wanted Kentucky to be the spokesman for the South. A new party called the Conservative Union or Constitutional Union Democratic Party. And now, they're really strange. They don't really have a platform. They describe themselves as being not black orientated. Now, what does that mean? I guess it means that they're not really for, civil rights for the blacks, but they're not really against the blacks. They're kind of on the fence. They were not Republican. They're not reactionaries or Democrats. They're trying to project themselves as being the good alternative to being Republican or Democrat. They supported the Union, but they were not for the end of slavery. Now, all 3 of them get together and engage in this big propaganda war, trying to gain voters, and of course the new party doesn't last very long. But the new organizations inside the both Democrats and Republicans, they were mostly all former Confederates or had Confederate leanings. And at the end of the 10 years, the Democrats came out on top, and they were going to control our legislature for the next several decades. Meanwhile, violence is still going on all over the state, big time. And like I say, we get more into the regulators in the next chapter. So violence continues, and Kentucky's developing a reputation of being a very, very violent state. But the Freedmen's Bureau was gone, and oh man, we were just tickled to death about that. We got rid of it, we think. Actually, the constitutional amendment allowing it read out, as well as funds. And Reconstruction ends with the election of President Hayes in 1877 with a notorious deal where he agreed to gain electoral votes from Florida and Louisiana to win the presidency, that he would withdraw federal troops from the South. And of course, once he withdrew the federal troops from the South, any gains that the black men had made were gone almost immediately. They were only there as long as the dreaded Blue Belly was there to enforce it. So what were the results after 10 years? Well, on March the 30th, 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution had given black men the right to vote. And our angry Democrats in our state said that the party must be a white man's party, free of any black voters. But with this new amendment, of course, we had thousands of newly freed blacks that had become enfranchised, and they were signing up for the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. And in all honesty, a lot of areas that had been totally Democratic in the past suddenly saw a two-party system develop. And by the 1871-72, the Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, had finalized and stabilized and taken on all the characteristics it's going to retain for the next several decades. The Republican Party is going to be a party of contrast. It's going to be made up chiefly of economically disadvantaged blacks, Eastern Kentucky whites, but of course it's going to be led by wealthy white urbanites from Louisville. So by 1875, the patterns for the next few decades were established. Like I said, the Freedmen's Bureau is gone, Reconstruction's fading, and issues in the parties not getting along and fracturing so badly, it seemed to be receding. Much had been decided, but really not the role for blacks. There had been some gains, few gains, but not many. We had begrudgingly accepted them as citizens and allowed them to vote. We allowed them to testify in court, and they could sit on juries. And in Louisville, a lawyer by the name of Nathaniel Harper, a black man, was allowed to practice, as well as here in Owensboro, George A. Griffith, a black man. Blacks were living in the cities among the whites. Not an awful lot of it, but it was there. And blacks could run for and win political offices, although minor offices. For instance, they would run and on the city council or sheriff in some areas, but not a lot. But at least they were making small baby steps. In Hopkinsville, a black man even sat on the city council. But as the years wore on after 1875, segregation is increasing quite rapidly in other areas, and there wasn't any sudden changes. It was slow. Cities began to enact codes, or black codes, and a lot of times they would just take the old slave code and put the word black instead of slave. Schools that had started out segregated stayed segregated. They even, which I thought was kind of funny, in the state penitentiary, they segregated church services to keep the black convicts away from the white convicts. Vagrancy laws were used to enslave blacks. That was clever the way they did that. They'd stop a black man on the streets, and if he didn't have a job or a pass from his job, he could be arrested and fined. And if he didn't have the money to pay the fine, then the county or the city or the town would sell his services for a time period to pay the fine. 6 months to a year, sometimes 3 years. They were not going to have any black men loitering around in town. Absolutely not. Violence are continuing. They even set up departments for colored departments in various areas. Out migration, the blacks that could afford to leave did, and even some whites who could afford to leave because the violence was so bad. The blacks in Kentucky had discovered that the promised land did not lay in Kentucky, it lay elsewhere. So do read the entire chapter, even though I skipped much of the middle about all the elections held between 1865 and 1877. Like I say, unless you're into political science, it's the same old stuff. And I'll tell you this, I didn't ask any questions on that section of the chapter. Does that make you feel better? And as I promised, no more lengthy lectures, although the next lecture is going to be a little bit longer than this one because it covers a very violent time, the last decade of the century, and a governor getting assassinated. So go over your notes and maybe review the lectures and take your quiz and the graded assignment. Then review all your notes and take your test. That being said, I wish you good luck and enjoy your spring break.